Hello and welcome. This is the section at the Cloud Security Alliance 2023 Zero Trust Summit around visibility and analytics, orchestration, and automation. The title of this is Let's Add Some Visibility to Zero Trust. If you think about all the things you do in Zero Trust, visibility is probably one of the most important components as you start thinking about Zero Trust. So I am Jerry Chapman. I am the co-chair of the CISA Zero Trust Working Group. So let's get started. When I do this, I typically like to start with a foundation of what is Zero Trust. So rather than reading this very long definition, but this comes out of the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council to the White House as a definition of what is Zero Trust. And to be clear, it's really a strategy that is really based upon a premise, a principle, an architecture, or a mindset that's really around protecting your business assets from users, whether those users are people, processes, or non-human entities, as I like to call them. There's no implicit trust. When I talk about Zero Trust, it's really this notion of explicit trust. So you must define who has access. So as you start reading through this and you think about this definition of Zero Trust, it's really just no one gets access unless they are explicitly defined to get access, period. So let's move forward now that we've got the common definition of Zero Trust. Let's just move forward. The CISA maturity model that came out earlier this year, the 2.0 version, really did a great job of defining the pillars of Zero Trust. First, we have identity. Identity obviously is that human or non-human entity that gets access to business resources. I'm going to talk about the levels of maturity as we go through this. I have another slide in a few minutes that will really get into the depth of the maturity around this, but more specifically, we'll get into some of the cross-cutting pillars I'll talk about in a minute. The next one is devices. Devices, again, IoT devices, OT devices, any device that gains access to a resource. Networks is another one. Networks is a foundation or a pillar when you start thinking about that OSI model between layer 3 through layer 7. Applications and workloads are another pillar. And then finally, data. CISA does a really good job of defining each of these pillars, what's inside of those pillars, and how to move across the maturity model of these pillars. However, these pillars cannot stand on their own to drive Zero Trust, which is really what this is all about. If you look at the bottom here, we have visibility and analytics, automation and orchestration. These are the two things that we are going to absolutely focus on for the next 15, 20 minutes. Governance is not something we're going to spend some time on, but it's another one of those cross-cutting pillars that each of these pillars must be a part of. Now, as we get through this, I'm going to talk about the traditional, the initial, the advanced, and the optimal stage of maturity as defined by the CISA maturity model. As we start talking about the definition of these things, we really need to get into a clear definition of what is automation and orchestration. Automation and orchestration is a Zero Trust architecture to operationalize and improve the user experience, time to access, security, and to control risk from an operational point of view. So if you think about what that means, that is, as events are taking place, as elements or as things are happening in your environment, incidents, standard operating procedures, whatever they happen to be, the automation and orchestration looks at it from this real-time perspective and the capabilities to improve some of these elements I've already outlined. Visibility and analytics is the Zero Trust architecture to improve security and reduce risk from a logging and monitoring perspective. So in order to really gain an understanding of your environment, you have to get all of this data in. We're going to talk a little bit about what this means a little more, but just having this clear definition of what is automation and orchestration, visibility and analytics is really important as we move forward. And I think it's really, really critical to talk about this document, or to more importantly, to talk about this logical architecture when you start thinking about zero trust. And more importantly, when it's visibility and analytics, orchestration and automation. You think about the control plane and the data plane. And more importantly, in the control plane, you think about the policy engine and the policy administration or administrator. This is effectively the policy decision point. Now, you've heard all of this. That's not that critical. But to understand that this is where the signals come in to help drive policy in a zero trust architecture. So if you look across the sides of these things, the PDP, or the policy engine and policy administrator, will get signals from things like your CDM system. We'll get things from compliance-based systems. Threat intelligence is going to drive some of these signals very, very clearly into what you're trying to do. What's suspect on your network? What kind of activity logs? If you're thinking about the analytics, visibility and analytics, you're going to get the logging data, the monitoring data to understand what's changing. Is there an actual incident that's going on? Is there some anomaly taking place in the environment? Data access policies, PKI, identity management, SIM systems, all of these components must feed through the control plane into the policy decision point. In this case, the PDP, or the policy engine and the policy administrator. The policy enforcement point in this environment, really critical to be able to receive those data now, or to receive that data. I think it's very important to note that while the visibility and analytics is taking place based on what's happening in the data plane, the subject in this diagram has to access an enterprise resource. The visibility and analytics is going to collect the data from both the subject side, whether they're on a managed or unmanaged device, doesn't matter because it's ultimately untrusted. The policy enforcement point is going to pull in that data and be able to make decisions based on what the policy decision point is feeding it, and then determine authorization based on explicitly allowing access. Visibility and analytics is going to pull all that data in and collect it, and then be able to feed that data back to the policy decision point in order to determine, is this a policy that needs to change? Is there something different that needs to happen within this environment? Is there something I should do differently? Or ultimately, no, this explicitly defined access is 100% the access necessary and required for the subject to do the things they need to do. So if you understand the NIST 800-207 at a high level, let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about maturity. When you think about visibility and analytics and automation and orchestration, there are 4 models that are associated with maturity. You have the traditional model. You have initial, advanced, and optimal. I'm going to go through each one of these. I'm not going to read this, I promise. But I'm going to go through this so that you kind of get a sense of what's happening at different layers of maturity. And every organization, let's be very clear, every organization is going to be on a different location or a different spot in their maturity. But ultimately, they are going to want to move up the ladder, if you will, to a more advanced stage. The traditional approach with visibility and analytics and automation and orchestration is typically a limited set of logs or a limited set of processes. In some cases, the logs may be limited to a single business system. Whereas in the last slide, there was a full system where I go from subject to a business resource. There may not be full logs going across that system. And in that description, I said if something changes and other signals are going to the PDP, that there may be some dynamic access or changes to the access that may be required. In a traditional environment, you're going to get a set of limited logs. And most of the time, there is no automated signals that are potentially going back to the PDP, the policy decision point, to ultimately define whether or not you have access. That's a traditional. So it's a very small scale It's not something that an organization wants to stay at because you don't have a full enterprise understanding of what's going on in your environment. In initial mode, as you become more advanced, automation now becomes more of a conversation. So as you start to collect more logs, as you think about the slide with the single business resource that the subject is trying to gain access to, where you may still get limited visibility into that. So not every resource, maybe the endpoint's not providing data, but the PEP is providing data. The enterprise resource is providing data. You now have the capability to see more data and correlate that data to maybe more events that are taking place. Maybe even critical functions like your identity solution is driving some of the access. In the automation and orchestration, you're starting to see responses. So something has changed. Let's send that back to the policy decision point. So the orchestration, automation, and orchestration are becoming a more significant part of the conversation. The signals you're getting in or the events you're getting in may or may not be as much of a false positive. In the advanced mode, as you start climbing further up that mountain, if you will, you're expanding that. You're starting to go across all parts of that system to really gain an insight. It may not only be the physical network, the endpoint device. It could be virtualized systems where you're starting to pull in all of that data. You're starting to get more signals. You're getting a centralized location where all of that data is being correlated. And now you're putting identities on top of that. You're putting an understanding of who is doing what in the environment. And from an automation and orchestration perspective, you're really starting to get the capability to respond to more and more true events and less false positives. And as you move to optimal, it's very important to understand that you've got a full view of the environment. You are pulling in every log possible. Potentially every log possible. You are now making real-time decisions. Your analytics have the capability to understand what is happening in that environment. They have the capability to not only understand and see the things, but then ultimately respond. They have the capability to view what's happening in the environment and say, oh, wait, this is a true event. Let's contain something that's happening in the environment. Let's shut down access. And that is a true zero trust, that is a zero trust architecture operating at the optimal level where I'm not only responding, but I'm responding to real events and I'm not chasing a lot of false positives. Now, this is what I would say the current maturity model in the environment. This is something that organizations are striving for. It really does outline a good set of policies, a good set of understanding of the environment. But in the future, I think it's important to pull this out, that AI is going to become a higher significant contributor to the optimal environment. And some of the stuff that you see in the advanced mode will kind of move down the chain a little bit or down the mountain a little bit. AI is going to become that tool. And I want to be very specific. AI is going to become that tool that's going to help you drive better decision-making processes. AI is going to become that tool to help you see a more advanced positive, not a false positive, but a more advanced positive, and then be able to respond faster. AI is going to be the tool, and I'm being very specific to say it's going to become a tool. Ultimately, AI is not going to be released in the world, in the environment, to do everything, because what you're going to find is AI is much like the old adage that we've been brought up in with garbage in, garbage out. So if you think about, well, I want AI to be in my optimal maturity, what I really need to think through here is, well, how does this really work? Well, if I put garbage in, and in this first model, it's a perfect model. It's been trained. It does everything it should do, but the data is bad. The data coming in is not bad, or is not good. the data coming in is bad, and therefore the data coming out is going to be bad, or the results are going to be bad. So garbage in, garbage out. Same thing if you improperly train a model. So you didn't feed appropriate training data into a model. You can bring the best data in the world in, but you're still going to get bad data. So not only can the data be wrong that you're bringing in to actually get a result from, but the training of the AI model can be wrong. And that's where the garbage model comes from that would still provide garbage results. And then ultimately, the optimal solution that I think the optimal level of maturity is going to pull from is this curated model, where I have created a good data structure that I have used to appropriately train my AI engine. And if that is true, then the curated data, the appropriate data model coming in is going to give me results that are truly effective and I can ultimately trust. So I think it's important when you start thinking about AI and how is AI going to be a part of your zero trust model, and in this case, visibility and analytics, I think it's going to be a huge contributor to what's happening in the visibility, analytics, orchestration, and automation model, because it has the capability to process data faster than any human, where it can process entire data lakes in minutes. Human may take hours. But again, understand it is a tool that has to be trained properly, and then ultimately you can trust the results. Okay, I spent enough time on AI, spent enough time on that model. Let's kind of dive back a little deeper into what I would say the next level of that control plane. So in the 800-207 document, it did speak a lot on how to deploy a logical or a theoretical zero trust architecture where you had that control plane, and in that control plane you had the capabilities for policy engine and policy administrators. The data plane just kind of executed. What we've seen recently is the NIST 800-207A documentation has come out and said, hey, act in a native cloud environment. What does access control look like? What does visibility and analytics and orchestration automation look like in a native environment? Now, I would argue that you could ultimately take this to the next level and say it's not just for cloud native environments. It could be in my private cloud. I could effectively use this in my internal network. Now, that might be an internal network that goes across a wide area network, and however that's set up, I may have direct connections, site-to-site connections, or I may be using the cloud, or I may be using a hybrid model in the cloud where I do have a private cloud, but I also have a public cloud. And there's a lot of options you can start thinking about as you start thinking about how do you deploy zero trust, and more importantly, how is the control plane managed in a zero trust world. And as more organizations are obviously more global, this becomes a bigger conversation. So the control plane ultimately gets broken down into 3 planes. So now I have at the local control plane, let's start at the bottom of this diagram as opposed to the top. At the bottom of this diagram, at my different sites, at my different cloud security provider models, I may have visibility and analytics into that specific site or that specific tenant of my CSP or that specific location, wherever that is across the globe. And I see that information at that level. Because quite frankly, a single PDP that may need to correlate all this data can't do it across the globe all at once. So they've broken this down into local control planes. So now you've got site specific or CSP specific or tenant specific control planes that are collecting this data. And then you kind of move that up to what I would call a global control plane. So now where I may have 15 sites or 15 locations or pops across the globe that ultimately gives me access to see visibility at that site or that location or in that region or that zone of the world, in the environment. But that can now roll up to a global control plane. So now all that visibility that's going down, I don't have a single PDP. I have an oversight PDP, if you will, that's now managing that data and bringing that data up into a more global view, but still keeping that data down locally. And then ultimately, what you get is the management control plane, which is that management component where the users may need to see what's going on, to have the access to the environment. There are now tools that give me access into either the global control plane or the local control plane, really dependent upon what I'm trying to accomplish. And then automation, all of that happens in the management plane. What's important here is that nebulous control plane that 800-207 documentation started out with, very good information, provided a lot of capabilities for signals. They have now broken down into a smaller bite-sized chunks, if you will, to say, I can now have this visibility and analytics and automation and orchestration at a local level, raise that visibility up to the global plane, and then ultimately manage all of that data across the entire globe, across all my sites, across every CSP, and be able to support that. All of these things are coming together and providing this single pane of glass. Hate the word, hate the description, but really that single pane of glass against my global infrastructure, regardless of where it sits, whether it's in a cloud native, a hybrid environment. But now I can manage it and see that. And then ultimately have the capability to drill deeper when I get into those local control planes. So all of this really to talk about where visibility and analytics is such a crucial part of the zero trust conversation, where I cannot deploy zero trust without visibility. I cannot respond or maintain and respond to events in my environment. If you think about the 5-step process that came out of the Instack document, that last step 5 is maintain and monitor your network. What I would say is you want to maintain and monitor your environment, which includes your network, and then have the capability to respond. The visibility and analytics gives you the capability to see, to maintain and monitor and see all of that. The automation and orchestration is the last term that I just used, respond. I want to thank you for your time today, and I appreciate you being here, and have a good day.